Today's lesson is leftovers to leave off your plate. Hi, everybody. My name is Roger.
Hello, I'm Kiki.
And today we're going to be talking about leftovers, food that you did not eat during your meal, but you've decided to keep them anyway. This is usually when you eat at home. If you eat some food at a restaurant and you have some left over, well, you could take that home, and those could also be considered leftovers.
Okay, so let's begin our lesson by listening to the first part.
Leftovers to leave off your plate?
Some people avoid throwing away leftovers because they can't bear the thought of wasting food. While avoiding waste is a good habit, some cooked foods can make you sick if you eat them as leftovers. Here are some foods that you may want to be careful about.
大家好，我们来介绍标题中的名词 leftover， 它的意思是剩菜剩饭。这个字当剩菜剩饭用时，常使用复数型 leftovers。例如 Dad didn't have time to make dinner, so we'll just eat leftovers from yesterday. 爸爸没时间做晚餐，所以我们就吃昨天的剩菜。又或者说 Derek packed leftovers from the restaurant as his lunch tomorrow. Derek 打包了餐厅的剩菜当明天的午餐。另外 leftover 也可以当形容词，它指的是剩下的。举例来说Shelley collected leftover clothes and sewed them into quilts. Shelley 收集剩下的衣服布料，并把它们缝成拼布被。再举一个例子 The leftover chicken was cut up for a salad. 剩下的鸡肉被切块用来做成沙拉。接下来介绍片语 leave off， 指的是剔除、排除在名单外。例如 Leaving Celine off our guest list will be a relief to everyone. 把 Celine 从我们的邀请名单上剔除，这对所有人来说都会是个解脱。
Okay, so it's interesting today that the title of our article is actually a question, leftovers to leave off your plate. Of course, I just talked about what leftovers are, but here we've got the verb phrase to leave off, which means you don't let them stay there longer, okay? You leave them off the plate, and you just simply do not keep those leftovers. And here we begin the lesson by saying some people avoid throwing away leftovers because they can't bear the thought of wasting food. Yeah, I'm kind of like that myself. If we don't finish food in the restaurant, I like to take the food to go and maybe heat it up in the microwave later at home. But our article here is going to tell us some food is not good for that. Some food will spoil, it will make you sick if you have them as leftovers.
And here we see the word bear. When somebody can't bear something, it's the fact that they can't stand something. So I can't bear the thought of losing my dog. So I can't stand the thought, or I can't even imagine what it's like if my dog runs away. I can't bear that type of sadness and pain.
Yeah, you just can't take that idea. It's too terrible to think about. And yes, indeed, some people can't bear the thought of wasting food. Indeed, I don't like to waste food myself, so I do like to have leftovers. And while avoiding waste is a good habit, some cooked foods can make you sick if you eat them as leftovers. So indeed, you can't always keep every item of food and eat it later. Some items of food, or some kinds of food, are best left to be thrown out or recycled, and you shouldn't feel too guilty about creating those leftovers. And here are some foods that you may want to be careful about, and that's the introduction to our lesson for today. In the second part, we'll find out what some of those foods are. So let's get to it. Let's listen to the second part, and then we'll talk about it.
Leafy green vegetables such as spinach, as well as root veggies like beets and carrots, are loaded with nitrates, which aren't harmful in themselves. However, when these vegetables are cooked and subsequently reheated, the nitrates undergo a chemical change that potentially leads to cancer-causing effects. Leftover potatoes and rice could be problematic as well. When cooked potatoes are left in warm temperatures, a dangerous bacteria can grow on them. This bacteria causes botulism, a deadly disease that affects our nervous system. Illness-provoking bacterial spores can similarly multiply on cooked rice. So if you plan on storing away freshly cooked potatoes or rice for another meal, refrigerate them immediately. instead of letting them cool to room temperature first.
第二部分我们看到动词 undergo， 意思是经历、遭受或是接受。例如 Olympic athletes must undergo years of training before they can compete. 奥运选手在上场比赛前必须经历多年的训练。或是 The neighborhood has undergone many changes over the last few decades. 这一带过去几十年来经历了许多变化。下一个我们看到副词 potentially， 它的意思是可能的、潜在的。例如 This deal could potentially bring in millions of dollars if everything goes well. 如果一切顺利进行，这笔交易可能会带来数百万美金的收益。又或者说 Charles always acts carefully to avoid potentially dangerous situations. Charles 总是小心行事，以避免潜在的危险情况。再来我们看到形容词 problematic， 意思是构成问题的或是疑难的。例如 The new work schedule is problematic for Daisy as her workload keeps growing. 新的工作时程表对 Daisy 来说构成问题，因为她的工作量持续增加。或是 Production has been problematic recently due to factory worker strikes. 由于工厂员工罢工的关系，产量最近出现了问题。
Okay, as promised, we are going to now learn some foods that you may want to be careful about, and you may not want to have them as leftovers. So here in the second paragraph, it begins by saying, leafy green vegetables such as spinach, as well as root veggies like beets and carrots, are loaded with nitrates, which aren't harmful in themselves. Okay, so that kind of introduces us to this particular topic, spinach. That's a type of leafy green vegetables, and there are lots of kinds of different leafy green vegetables that you can get in markets here and at restaurants, but we're giving you the example of spinach here. We're also talking about root veggies or root vegetables like beets and carrots. Those are vegetables that grow underground, but their greens are above ground. Now, I like to eat carrots, but beets I've had trouble adjusting to over the years. Are you a big fan of beets, Kiki?
No, I'm not.
Right,
Not at all.
Okay, so some people just don't like beets, but we're talking about these root veggies, such as beets and carrots, and they've got lots of nitrates in them. That's a chemical term. A nitrate is like a salt of nitric acid, and it contains NO3, nitrogen with 3 oxygen atoms bound together, and it's kind of a group of chemicals that are used as fertilizers, and I'm guessing they're probably fairly harmful, I guess, in some situations, but here it says they aren't harmful in themselves. But it says, however, when these vegetables are cooked and subsequently reheated, the nitrates undergo a chemical change that potentially leads to cancer-causing effects. So nitrates in themselves are not particularly harmful, but if you reheat them, then they undergo a chemical change. Now, here we've got the word subsequently. Subsequently here is an adverb. It just means coming after something else, okay? So if they are cooked and then reheated, then they undergo a chemical change. Now, what does it mean to undergo something?
So undergo is a verb, and when somebody undergoes something, you can experience a type of change or you're undergoing a development. Maybe children, when they're growing up, they undergo puberty because their bodies are changing. They're growing up. They're growing taller. They're turning into an adult. So when you undergo something, that's when you change from one state to another.
Right. You may have some kind of problem with your body, so you may undergo surgery. And undergo here in the past tense is underwent. I underwent surgery yesterday and I'm feeling fine today. In this particular case, if the nitrates are reheated, then they will undergo a chemical change that potentially leads to cancer-causing effects. Now, if something's potential, it has the possibility of happening in the future. And here it's an adverb. This chemical change potentially leads to cancer-causing effects. In other words, it is possible possible that they could cause cancer if you reheat these nitrates, so you probably don't want to do that. Now let's move on now to the next paragraph here. It says, leftover potatoes and rice could be problematic as well. If something's problematic, it's possible for it to cause a problem, or there is the possibility of it having a problem. And so in this particular case, you got to watch out for those potatoes and rice. If you eat those as leftovers and you're not careful with them, they could make you sick.
So, for example, I hurt my knee, which might be problematic when I have to drive long distances.
Indeed, that could hurt if you need to drive from Taipei all the way down to Kaohsiung and you have a bad knee. That might be problematic. I could also say that my neighbor's barking dog has become problematic. We need to deal with that situation because the dog is barking all the time and it's driving me crazy. But again, we're talking about leftover potatoes and rice. They could be problematic. And when cooked potatoes are left in warm temperatures, a dangerous bacteria can grow on them. That does not sound very good. So if you cook a potato and then you leave it in a place with a warm temperature, then this kind of bacteria could start to grow on those potatoes. And this bacteria causes botulism, which is a kind of situation having to do with the nerves. Here it says it's a deadly disease that affects our nervous system. And that, of course, is in our bodies. And if it affects our nervous system, we could experience some pain and other difficult situations. And illness-provoking bacterial spores can similarly multiply on cooked rice. So if something provokes something, it causes it to happen. For example, if you got in a fight with somebody, you might think, well, he provoked me. He called my mother a bad name, and if therefore I had to punch him in the face, he provoked me. And in this particular case, the bacterial spores could provoke an illness. A spore is a kind of one-celled organism that can reproduce itself, and that usually has to do with mold. So yes, you could have moldy rice, and as they say, if you eat food that is moldy, you could get very sick indeed.
And usually spores are also the way flowers and mushrooms repopulate.
So indeed, that is a chemical term there or a biological term there. So you got to watch out for bacterial spores. They can multiply on cooked rice, which means they can just keep on growing and keep on growing. And that's why you're going to have all that mold there. I think we've all at one time or another put rice in the refrigerator and we kind of forgot about it. And then we took off the lid. It's, ugh, what's all that green stuff growing on the rice? That's disgusting.
Well, one time I was actually very shocked because we had leftover rice, and not only did we see green rice, there was also purple and yellow all together because we forgot about the rice.
My goodness.
That was really weird.
Well, I bet you probably did not eat that rice.
No.
Although it would have made an interesting photograph to post on Facebook or something like that. But again, that could happen on the rice and on the potatoes. So if you plan on storing away freshly cooked potatoes or rice for another meal, refrigerate them immediately instead of letting them cool to room temperature first. They do say this sometimes. There have been some scientific experiments that say food or hot water actually cools down faster if you put it straight in the freezer instead of waiting for it to cool down first. So this applies to potatoes and rice as well. If you want to eat them again in the future, put them in the refrigerator right away.
So here we see refrigerate them. When you refrigerate something, it's to make something cold or let them be able to cool. And usually that's why we have the word refrigerator. So when we put things in our fridge or when we put things in our refrigerator, we are letting these things cool down or keeping them cool.
Right, refrigerate. Refrigerated foods, for example. And that's one piece of advice that we should all keep in mind regarding leftovers. Okay, that brings us to the third and final part of our lesson for today. We're going to listen to it first.
Fresh mushrooms are also prone to microorganisms, so try to finish them in one meal. As leftovers, they should be eaten cold, directly from the fridge. Avoiding food waste shouldn't lead to food poisoning, so always stay on the safe side when it comes to leftovers.
第三部分我们看到片语 be prone to 加名词、动词或是动词 ing， 指的是易于点点点或是有点点点倾向。举例来说 This part of the country is prone to forest fires in the summer. 该国的那个地区在夏天易有森林大火。下一个例子 Daniel is prone to get angry when things don't go his way. Daniel 在事情不如他意时容易发火。最后一个例子 Since my dad has gotten older, he is prone to forgetting things. 自从我爸爸上了年纪，他很容易忘东忘西。
Okay, so far we've talked about green vegetables like spinach, we've talked about root veggies like beets and carrots, and we just got done talking about potatoes and rice. Now let's talk about mushrooms. Fresh mushrooms are also prone to microorganisms. So if something's prone to something, that means it's very likely that it will have this situation. So it's very possible for fresh mushrooms to have microorganisms, which are living things that are very, very small.
So we should try to finish all our mushrooms in one meal. And try not to leave mushrooms overnight and put it back in the fridge because there's a very high possibility that these microorganisms will start to multiply. So as leftovers, they should be eaten cold directly from the fridge. That's something I didn't know because usually when we do have leftover mushrooms, we actually reheat it. So if we actually eat it straight out of the fridge, it's actually better.
That's what it says here. If you're going to have mushrooms as leftovers, then you should be eating them cold, straight from the refrigerator. So don't reheat them. That seems to be the advice for today. And that's a problem with mushrooms. They're prone to microorganisms, or it's very possible for them to have microorganisms growing on them, which could cause some problems and make you sick and make you throw up and have to go see the doctor. And no one wants to have those things happen to them. So here's the final word. It says, avoiding food waste shouldn't lead to food poisoning. Food poisoning is a dangerous situation. I think we've all experienced it from time to time. Restaurants can't always keep an eye on the food 24 hours a day. Sometimes some food slips through and makes us sick, or we don't cook the food properly ourselves. Have you ever experienced food poisoning before, Kiki?
Yes, I have. And I experienced at the same time with my sister. So we both had to go to the hospital and get an IV drip.
Ooh.
We actually didn't know how we got the food poisoning.
Oh, you don't, huh? But you evidently got it from the same source. It's kind of
Right.
an interesting coincidence there. Maybe it was food from a particular restaurant or something, but I'm sure you did some investigation into that. But again, we shouldn't have food poisoning from food waste. You can certainly have those leftovers, but please do know what you're doing. And here the final sentence for today says, so always stay on the safe side when it comes to leftovers. So when it comes to just means when we talk about leftover food, when this is the subject of conversation, then we should stay on the safe side. That reminds me of another phrase we use in English. It's better to be safe than sorry. So if you have some food and you're not sure if it should be kept as a leftover or not, it's probably best just to send it to the recyclers when that garbage truck comes around and be safe that way. And it's better to be safe than sorry sometimes.
And I think a good lesson to learn from today's article is that I know a lot of people, we don't want to waste food. So I think there are other ways to take care of food waste by maybe reducing the amount of leftovers we have. So maybe we don't have to cook as much as we usually do. Maybe if you start to realize, oh, the usual amount that I'm cooking, I get too much leftover. Maybe next time I cook the same dish, I'll use a little less. Because even if you don't cook enough, you can always eat something else, right?
Certainly indeed. So it's kind of hard to know sometimes how much food to prepare, especially if we're putting on a banquet for somebody. We usually are going to prepare way too much food because if we don't have enough, that would be very embarrassing. Okay, that brings us to the end of our discussion for today. Let's turn things over now to Hanny.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文第二部分呢，有出现 subsequently 还有 provoke 这两个单字，那我们就要来帮同学们补充他们的字首字根咯。好，首先看到 subsequently 它是副词，表示随后接着。好，那当我们看到 sequ 或是 secu 或是 sue 这一类的字根呢，它有紧跟、跟随 follow 的那种意思。像电影、书籍、戏剧等等的续集叫做 sequel， 那就可以看出这个字根的语义吧。好，那我们看到在 subsequently 这个字当中，它的字首 sub 表示接近或者是次于，那么字根 sequ 表示跟随，ENT 是形容词字尾，先把这三个部分合在一起变成 subsequent， 它是形容随后的、后来的，然后我们再加上副词字尾 ly， 就会得到这个单字 subsequently 去表达随后、紧接着。好，那也补充两个有这一类字根的单字，第一个是 consequent， 它的字首 con 表示共同或是一起，那么字根 sequ 表示跟随，那么 ent 是形容词字尾。好，那我们想着跟着一起来，随着一起来，应该很容易联想到 consequent 可以表达随之而来的、随之发生的。再下一个补充的是 persecution， P-E-R-S-E-C-U-T-I-O-N。 好，那它的字首 P-E-R 表示彻底，字根 S-E-C-U 表示跟随， T-I-O-N 是名词字尾。当某个人一直如影随形，跟在你后面跟得很彻底，是不是会让人觉得很不舒服、很困扰呢？用这样的方式，也许可以去联想到 persecution 它有迫害、困扰的意思咯。好，那我们看到 provoke 这个动词它在文中有那种引起、激起的意思。那当我们看到 VOK 或是 VOC 或是 VOW 这一类的字根，它就带有 call、speak、sound、voice 等等的意思，去表达说话、叫喊或者是声音。像单字 vocal 是声音的， vowel 母音等等，这些都可以看出其实会跟声音有关嘛。那么在我们的单字 provoke 当中，它的字首 pro 表示在点点点之前，字根 voke 表示叫喊。当有人站在前面叫喊，就好像在呛下带有挑衅意味时，应该就可以有联想到说 provoke 它有挑衅、煽动、激怒、激起的意思。我们也顺便补充两个有相同字根的单字，第一个是 evoke， 那它的字首 e 有向外、由内向外的语义， voke 表示叫喊，那么字面意思就是向外呼喊。 evoke 这个字以前就多多少少带有招魂、呼唤亡灵的语义，那我们也应该很容易联想到 evoke 它有唤起、引起的意思，可能像是唤起记忆情感等等。第二个补充的是 convoke， 它的字首 con 表示一起，那么 voke 表示叫喊、召唤，叫大家一起过来，应该可以联想到 convoke 它就有召集的意思。好，那以上是今天重点整理，我们来回顾今天的单字吧。
Leftover. I'm having leftovers from last night for lunch today. Subsequently. Katie left her phone at home and subsequently missed an important call from a client. Undergo. Mr. Foster will undergo back surgery next week. Potentially. Dana said she's interested in potentially joining our book club. Problematic. The behavior of Mario's cat has become increasingly problematic. Provoke. The politician's comments were clearly designed to provoke a reaction from the audience. Refrigerate. Milk should be refrigerated to keep it from spoiling.
Discussion starter starts now!
Here's our discussion starter, and the question is, what are some other important safety tips you've heard about food or food preparation?
I've learned that when we're preparing chicken, it's important to wash our chicken first. But when we're washing our chicken, we have to watch out for everything that's in the sink or everything around it. Because chicken, you can get salmonella very easily. And salmonella is another type of bacteria that you can get from food. So when you're preparing chicken, you should rinse the chicken, but right after, make sure you clean the sink and the area around it so it doesn't get onto other stuff like other ingredients or your other dishes.
That's good advice, but I think that we should always do some research first before we cook any kind of food to make sure what the temperature should be and how we should prepare it, how we should cut it, and whether or not we can keep it as leftovers. Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program, and please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Roger.
I am Kiki.
See you next time.